Overrating and underrating teams is still a massive problem in college football. The College Football Playoff Committee and rankings are never going to really be perfect, but I believe there are a select few teams that the committee and the public at large are dramatically overrating and underrating to varying degrees. So the College Football Playoff Committee's most recent rankings are up on the screen in front of you. You got Ohio State at 1, Indiana at 2, A&M at 3. The top 5 remains unchanged. Alabama 4th, Georgia 5th. The 6 through 10 spot changed a little bit. Texas Tech leapfrogged Ole Miss to be at 6th. Ole Miss is at 7th. Oregon's at 8th. Notre Dame is at 9th. Texas is at 10th. Most of these schools raised a spot because BYU dropped to 5th, and the final school in front of them is Oklahoma at 11th. We have Utah at 13th, Vanderbilt at 14th. Miami jumped 3 spots to 15th. We got Georgia Tech at 16th, USC at 17th, Michigan at 18th. Virginia dropped 5 spots to 19th. Louisville dropped 5 spots to 20th. Iowa only dropped 1 spot to 21st. Thought that was one of the more ingenious things the committee did in their rankings. I do think Iowa's one of the best 3-loss teams, if not the best in college football. Pittsburgh at 22nd, Tennessee at 23rd. USF jumped inside the top 25 to be 24th, and Cincinnati is not ranked. Here is how these rankings play out in a hypothetical bracket. So Alabama, Ohio State, A&M, and Indiana, they receive the first round bye. And then Georgia, Oregon, Texas Tech, and Ole Miss receive home games. Texas, Miami, Notre Dame, and USF, those are away teams that get into the playoffs. Miami is the highest ranked ACC team. Highly unlikely they'll win the ACC championship game. That there is a shot for them to do so. They could make it as an at-large, though, since they are placed 15th in the rankings, especially if the highest ranked ACC team or ACC champion, so the ACC champion, not highest ranked ACC champion, but if the ACC champion gets left into the playoffs entirely and Miami is just ranked high enough to not be the first team left out, we'll see how that goes. Oklahoma, BYU, Utah, and Vanderbilt are the first 4 out in this scenario, and USF is the G5 champion, the highest ranked G5 champion. So therefore, they get an invitation here, more likely than not as the 12 seed. This channel will make you a college football expert and help you enjoy watching games and make more accurate predictions. So what are you waiting for? Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, comment your thoughts, and watch the video all the way through so that you can get the full package. And check the description and pinned comment for more ways to help yourself and this channel. This is the Week 12 college football playoff bracket as it stands from the committee. Now I want to move on to the most overrated and most underrated teams, in my opinion. So let's start off by looking at the overrated teams and then move on to the underrated teams, saving the best for last. One of the more overrated teams in college football right now is the Ole Miss Rebels. So Ole Miss is 8th in S&P Plus, but they're 12th in FPI and FEI. Their only big win is over number 11 Oklahoma on the road. Now, they did play Georgia competitively on the road, and I do think Georgia's a really good team. But only beating Oklahoma, and then your other signature wins are LSU, South Carolina. They're probably going to get a win over Florida this Saturday, but how much does that mean? It kind of seems like Florida has quit. What signature victory does Ole Miss have, and how much of their power rating is made up by blowing out some inferior competition and priors where ever since Kiffin's second year, Ole Miss has on average been a top 25 team? I do not know how good Ole Miss is. I think they are good, but great. Top 10 good? I don't think so. The metrics don't really back that up. In fact, if you look at ESPN's efficiency metrics, which is just looking at a team from a per play perspective only for this year, so no priors, no recruiting rankings, Ole Miss isn't even top 15. They're just hovering around that 15th spot in between 20th and 15th. In FEI and FPI, we've already talked about, just power ratings wise, they're not top 10. They're just outside at 12th. Another team that is overvalued is BYU. They are 5 or more spots lower in all power ratings. So in FPI, they're 17th. In S&P Plus, I believe they're around there, maybe 18th, a little bit lower. Similar in FEI. In top 25 games, at home, they beat rival Utah 24-21 in a game where they basically won the turnover battle. Utah had more failed fourth down attempts than the Cougars did, and at one point led. So very back and forth, very competitive game. They're ranked right around where Utah is. So at best, based on that big game and their metrics, they're properly rated. You then look at Texas Tech, and Texas Tech won that game 29-7. But if Morton were healthy or their offensive line could pass protect, Texas Tech, more likely than not, makes things worse in that game than BYU makes things better if you simulate that game 1,000 times. So I believe that BYU's ranked too high at 12th. They, for me, to view them as a college football playoff team. We're not purely doing power ratings here. We're only factoring in power ratings when it doesn't match up with what the on-field product is. So we're weighing them out. Vegas should not determine who the playoff teams are. They should not. But we also shouldn't completely factor out metrics and go with feel-good stories. And that's what BYU is. BYU is a feel-good story. If they win out and then get blown out by Texas Tech again in the Big 12 title game, I do not want to see them in the 12-team playoff. They would not be deserving of an appearance there. We have Virginia at 19th in the rankings. Virginia is overrated because they're not even a top 40 team in power ratings. They win a ridiculous amount of one-score games. They play inspired. Their coaching has improved. This is Virginia's best team in a minute. It's their best under Tony Elliott. But when you lose to NC State and when you lose to Wake Forest, I am not going to take you seriously. I had a back and forth with Garrison from the Voice of College Football Ohio State channel. Garrison's a friend of the channel. And him and I were talking on Twitter about, would I pick Michigan to beat Virginia? And I said, easily. And he thought that was funny and a little bit out of pocket, a little bit overzealous by me. And from my perspective, Michigan's not great, but Virginia is winning a bunch of one-score games in the worst Power 4 conference. I think Michigan would probably, along with 20 other teams, handle this team at the lines of scrimmage and handle them in a very mean and nasty way. They are the one-score game winner kings, and they're not doing it in the fashion that Iowa does. I do not think it's sustainable. Maybe I'm wrong, but when you're 10 games in, like 9-10 games in as Virginia is, and you're still not power rated top 40, that means you are not a good team. They are a lucky team. They should not even be considered to get in the college football playoff unless they went out and win the ACC, at which point I think with 11 wins, they would probably at least flirt with deserving a playoff appearance. And then last overrated team before we move on to the underrateds. This is the one I have the least amount of gripes about because Tennessee is top 25 in power ratings. But I do think the way Hypo plays ball inflates how good this team looks in metrics by scoring 70 points on the weaker teams. The FCS teams, the G5 teams. As we've seen Tennessee progress through SEC play, Joey Aguilar has regressed. The team just doesn't look as impressive as it did last year, as it did earlier in the year when they played Georgia competitively. Their best wins are close losses to Georgia and Oklahoma and a performance against Alabama that was worse than the scoreboard indicated. Those are who I think the most overrated teams are at the moment. An honorable mention I would say is, how do I put this? Last week it would have been Washington, but Washington lost to Wisconsin. Another honorable mention, I would say, is at this point either Notre Dame or Miami. Honorable mention. Power ratings wise, they're accurately rated, if not underrated, but I'm not all that impressed with their resumes. So that's just something that I wanted to bring up there. Speaking of teams that I think have impressive resumes, though, that aren't as widely recognized as they should be, I give you Oregon as an underrated team. Their resume is not super strong from a merit-based angle, but from an analytical angle, they're almost unanimously top three. Kelly Ford does a good job with his ratings on Twitter. They're third there. They're third in S&P Plus, third in FEI, third in FPI. They're very close to Indiana and Ohio State, and they would be at the top of the SEC outside of maybe Alabama. Metrically, they wouldn't be, but I think you got to adjust for Alabama playing the gauntlet they have, which doesn't help their power ratings case. You do have to adjust for that. Power ratings get easily seduced by blowing out weaker competition. But Oregon, I think, is a underrated team that's being a little bit hated because, let's face it, the way that they play and the way Lanning acts rubs people the wrong way. They're not a media darling because they're not cute, and they're willing to win games in an ugly fashion. They talk a big game. They outspend everyone. They're out recruiting from a quality angle all the big teams, and the big teams don't like that. Their only loss is to a 10-0 Indiana, who's number 1 in FEI and number 2 in all the other metrics. That's their only loss. I have been on record for saying I don't think any other team goes into Autzen and beats that Oregon team the way Indiana does, and I firmly believe that. So maybe I'm wrong here, but the fact they won at Iowa, banged up with the travel, and beat Iowa at their own game gives me confidence that this team is better than the 8th best team in America and is decidedly in the top 10, whereas I'm seeing a lot of people on Twitter say they're overrated, and it's show me the evidence. I don't think you can. Texas Tech is underrated. Maybe not by the committee. 6th is probably appropriate, but a lot of people are comparing them to Georgia Tech or to many of the top-tier ACC teams, or even comparing them to Utah. That is heresy. Tech has something that very few teams in even the SEC and Big Ten have, and that is a NFL, and I mean truly NFL defensive line that translates to elite on-field product. So what do I mean by that? Well, Oregon and Ohio State probably have plenty of future NFL players in their defensive line, but they do not have the production that Texas Tech does there. Oregon doesn't even have 20 sacks. Ohio State does, but Texas Tech, I think, is more impressive by a mile compared to those two defensive lines and a lot of defensive lines in the SEC. What Indiana is able to get out of their defensive line in terms of sack and pressure production, Tech gets that without having to scheme the same way because they have just ridiculous amounts of NFL talent at edge, and they're deeper at defensive line than I think anyone predicted them to be, especially at defensive tackle where they've sustained injuries and haven't dropped off. They beat number 13 Utah and number 12 BYU by 46 total points. Average 23 points per victory. Their one loss is to a healthy Arizona State team on the road, where Tech played their worst game of the year and had a backup QB. Reminds me very much of what Oregon did at Iowa and what Indiana did at Penn State, except Tech didn't win because I think they're a tier below those two teams. But Tech's still really good. They're a great team. And to underestimate them, I think, is very faulty and not an appropriate thing to do. We're going to talk about it in a future video and segment, they might be able to win a title if Morton is healthy. Defensive line production and elite defensive line production is basically a prerequisite to win it all. Ohio State, Michigan, the last two Georgia teams have had that. Clemson teams under Dabo, especially the 18 team, had that. And even 20 Alabama, 19 LSU, like 17 Alabama especially, but more 19 LSU and 20 Bama, who are more known to be offensive. They still had great lines of scrimmage and great defensive lines. Tech has that. It's a question of what do they have elsewhere, and I think they have enough pieces elsewhere to potentially be in that national title conversation, especially if the bracket pans out well for them, and especially if they get a first round bye, which looks unlikely, but we'll see. Indiana is underrated. They're underrated because a lot of people are. So this is what's interesting with Indiana. A lot of people are talking about Ohio State is overrated, but they're just saying Ohio State's overrated, and they're not offering any alternative to who's number one. So what they're essentially telling you is either in some cases they want Ohio State to be worse than they are, but can't find any logical team to substitute them with, which is just bad journalism. On another hand, there are legitimate reasons to believe Ohio State is not as dominant as many of their fans believe, but they look really good. So maybe it's just a weaker number one than prior years. Well, with Indiana, they're number one in FEI, they're top two elsewhere. In a lot of power ratings, they're weighed down by the talent gap between those teams, which very well could come into play. But if Indiana enters the playoffs healthy, that may not matter all that much. And they beat Illinois, Penn State, number 21 Iowa, and number 8 Oregon. They beat Oregon by 10. They beat Illinois, who, based on projections, will probably enter the top 25 again, by 53 points. They beat Penn State by 4, or by 3, rather, and they beat Iowa by 5 and really 7 before that safety. 3 of those games were on the road. 2 of them were by 1 score. The one team they play at home, they beat by 53. From a merit-based perspective, they have the best resume in the country, and no one is better coached than them. No one. And I don't have them at number 1 right now, but the argument I would make for them being at number 1 is that they can run the ball in power situations, they can run it in explosive situations, they can pass the football deep, they can pass it intermediate, they can pass to the boundary over the middle across the field, they can stop the run, they can get pressure with 4, they can get home with a blitz, they can cover one-on-one with one of their corners in D'Angelo Pons. Their linebackers are deep. They can basically do everything given the right circumstances. And not even Ohio State can do that. They can't run the football. And no other team in America, I think, on a given day can be as complete as Indiana has shown. Doesn't mean they're the best, because they have some limitations in the talent and depth department that Ohio State and Alabama and other teams even on this list, like Oregon, don't have. But in terms of a complete team, Indiana has shown shades of greatness, shards of greatness in every category this year in a way that no other team has. So that's the argument for putting them at number 1 if you want to. And the fact that I don't really see anyone even entertaining that conversation outside of maybe Indiana fans tells me they're a bit underrated. On top of the resume angle, if you're truly ranking based on resume, Indiana should be at number 1 right now in any CFP ranking. And last but not least, Michigan. This was tough. There are probably other teams that are better suited up here. Michigan just has the 14th best strength of record. Kelly Ford's most deserving rankings, which talk about who deserves to be in the playoffs. They say Michigan's underrated. And Michigan's losses are to Oklahoma and USC on the road, which, depending on where you look, when those teams are healthy, they're top 10. And they've beaten everyone else, including a Washington team that many, not necessarily myself, but many respected for a while as maybe a top 20 caliber team, and they beat them pretty soundly. So Michigan, from a resume angle and a merit-based angle, should probably be viewed as top 15. Power ratings-wise, it's anywhere from top 20 to barely top 15 there. So that was tough. But especially with the first 3, Oregon, Texas Tech, and Indiana, I do believe them to be underrated. Let me know what you think about my overrated and underrated teams down in the comment section below. Would love to hear your thoughts, your disagreements, and if you have the time, give me some of your underrated and overrated teams and why. Thank you for watching. It's my mission on College Football with Sam to make you the most informed, knowledgeable, and entertained fan as possible. We aren't perfect, but we hit the nail on the head more often than we hit our thumb with the hammer. Make sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, comment, and if you're here, you've probably already watched the whole video. So thank you for doing those things.